In 2023, an event took place that shocked the world and set off a wave of reactions across various nations, religions, and political landscapes. This incident involved the controversial act of burning a copy of the Quran, the holy book of Islam, by a man named Salwan Momika. The story of this event, the controversy that followed, and the tragic consequences that unfolded in 2025 serve as a stark reminder of the complexities of modern-day freedom of expression, religious sensitivities, and the deep divisions that exist between different worldviews. For some, the act of burning the Quran represented a stand for free speech, a bold challenge against what they perceived as religious extremism. For others, it was a deeply offensive, blasphemous act that crossed a line, fueling hatred and intolerance. The burning of religious texts, particularly the Quran, has always been a highly sensitive issue, and Salwan Momika's action sparked an international debate on the boundaries of protest and the repercussions of such a bold act. As we dive deeper into the life of Salwan Momika, it becomes clear that this was not just a random incident but rather a culmination of personal choices, geopolitical tensions, and a global climate of growing polarization. Who was Salwan Momika? What motivated him to carry out this controversial act? And what happened after the flames of his protest were extinguished? Let's explore the events surrounding this momentous act and the tragic end that followed in 2025. Stay tuned as we unravel the story of Salwan Momika, his actions, and the aftermath that shook the world. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insights into this complex story and other global events. Salwan Momika's act of burning the Quran took place on a summer day in Stockholm, Sweden, a country known for its liberal stance on freedom of expression. It was the culmination of a series of protests and demonstrations against what some individuals, including Momika, believed were threats posed by Islamic extremism and the increasing influence of certain religious ideologies in Europe. However, burning a religious text is a highly provocative act, one that immediately sparked outrage among Muslim communities worldwide, as well as those who believed in the importance of respect for religious symbols. The incident was also caught on camera, quickly spreading across social media platforms. Within hours, the footage went viral, fueling further outrage and debate. To some, it was a symbol of defiance against religious authority, a message about the importance of free speech and secularism in an increasingly polarized world. To others, it was a deliberate attempt to provoke and insult a billion people who hold the Quran in reverence. The response to the incident was swift and varied. In Sweden, the authorities did not initially intervene, citing the country's laws on freedom of speech and assembly. However, this only escalated the situation. Protests erupted in several cities, with people from different countries condemning the act and calling for justice. Across the Muslim world, leaders and citizens alike expressed their outrage, demanding that the Swedish government take action against Salwan Momika. It was clear that this act of burning the Quran had ignited a firestorm of controversy, but it didn't stop there. As the international community responded, a broader discussion began to unfold about the limits of free speech, the need for respect between different cultures and religions, and the consequences of actions that challenged deeply held beliefs. In Sweden, the government faced intense pressure from foreign governments, including Islamic nations, to take a stronger stance. While Sweden prided itself on its free speech laws, the international condemnation of Momika's actions presented a dilemma for the Swedish authorities. Could they maintain their commitment to freedom of expression while addressing the offense that had been caused? The answer was far from simple. Behind the scenes, a number of political leaders were grappling with the fallout of the incident. Some feared the long-term consequences of such a provocative act on Sweden's diplomatic relations, particularly with Middle Eastern and Muslim-majority countries. Others, however, believed that the right to free expression, even when it is offensive or hurtful, should not be compromised. In the following weeks, the world saw an escalation of tensions, with protests spreading to other countries, and Salwan Momika became the face of this controversy. Many people saw him as a martyr for free speech, while others viewed him as an instigator of hatred and division. The lines between freedom of expression and respect for religious beliefs were drawn more sharply than ever, and the world found itself divided on this issue. Despite the intense media attention and global outcry, Salwan Momika remained defiant, stating in interviews and public appearances that his actions were not meant to incite violence but to make a point about the dangers of religious extremism. He believed that Europe, particularly Sweden, was becoming increasingly vulnerable to the influence of radical ideologies, and that challenging these ideologies was essential for preserving the freedoms and values of Western society. However, as time passed, Salwan Momika's actions would have unintended consequences that would resonate far beyond the borders of Sweden. The rise in anti-Muslim sentiment in some parts of Europe, the growth of nationalist movements, and the increasing frequency of violent attacks related to religious intolerance all pointed to a disturbing trend, one that was exacerbated by Momika's actions. In 2025, just 2 years after the controversial Quran burning incident, Salwan Momika's life would come to a tragic end. On a fateful day, he was killed in what appeared to be a targeted attack. The details surrounding his death were murky, but it was widely believed that it was the result of the extreme backlash from his actions. Some reports suggested that the attack was carried out by individuals seeking revenge for the burning of the Quran, while others speculated that it was part of a broader political plot. Whatever the exact circumstances of his death, it is clear that Salwan Momika's life, and ultimately his death, became a symbol of the deep divisions that continue to exist within societies grappling with questions of identity, freedom, and respect for cultural differences. His story raised important questions about the limits of free speech, the consequences of challenging religious beliefs, and the personal cost of standing up for one's convictions. As we reflect on the life of Salwan Momika, we are reminded of the complexities of the world we live in today. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the power of symbols, the fragility of peace in a divided world, and the dangerous consequences of provoking deeply held beliefs. The story of Salwan Momika and the aftermath of his actions serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities of modern geopolitics, social identity, and the role of religious symbols in fueling global tensions. His death in 2025, following his highly controversial Quran burning act, further intensified debates surrounding the concept of free speech and religious intolerance, while also highlighting the profound and lasting consequences that can arise from acts of defiance against established norms. Salwan Momika's actions had ignited a firestorm, one that was not easily extinguished. The act of burning the Quran had set in motion a series of events that rippled across Europe and beyond, challenging not only the Swedish government's stance on free expression but also the global dialogue on cultural respect, coexistence, and the role of religion in shaping public discourse. But what led to this tragic sequence of events? How did one man's defiance against religious orthodoxy evolve into a situation with far-reaching consequences? To understand the significance of Salwan Momika's actions, it's important to look at the broader context in which they occurred. Sweden, like many European countries, has long prided itself on its commitment to freedom of expression. This principle is enshrined in the country's constitution and forms the basis of its democratic values. However, in recent years, the issue of religious tolerance and the limits of free speech had become a growing point of contention, especially as Europe grappled with the complexities of multiculturalism, migration, and the rise of Islamic extremism. Momika, a man of Lebanese descent, had been living in Sweden for several years. He had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of Islam, particularly in response to what he saw as the growing influence of Islamic extremism in Europe. He viewed Europe's commitment to free speech and secularism as being under threat from what he perceived as the imposition of religious ideologies on public life. His frustration with what he saw as the unchecked spread of radical Islam led him to take drastic measures, culminating in the burning of the Quran. For Momika, the act of burning the Quran was not just an expression of free speech but a direct challenge to the religious orthodoxy that he believed was undermining European values. He saw himself as a defender of Western civilization, a protector of secularism, and a vocal critic of what he viewed as the dangers posed by Islamic extremism. However, in his quest to make a point, he failed to anticipate the scale of the backlash that his actions would provoke. What he saw as a courageous act of defiance would, in the eyes of many, be viewed as a deeply offensive and inflammatory gesture. The initial reaction to Momika's Quran burning act was one of shock and outrage. Across the Muslim world, his actions were seen as a direct assault on the sanctity of the Quran, a text that millions of people revere as the literal word of God. Protests erupted in several countries, with demonstrators demanding that the Swedish government take action against Momika. In Sweden itself, the incident sparked fierce debate, as citizens and politicians weighed in on the issue of free speech versus religious tolerance. The Swedish government, caught between its commitment to free expression and the pressure from foreign governments and religious groups, faced a difficult decision. While Sweden's constitution guarantees the right to freedom of expression, many felt that the burning of a religious text crossed a line. Some lawmakers called for a re-evaluation of the country's free speech laws, arguing that certain acts of provocation should be restricted in the interest of maintaining social harmony and respect for religious beliefs. At the same time, there was growing concern about the rise of far-right nationalist movements in Europe, many of which supported Momika's actions. These movements saw his act as a bold stand against the growing influence of Islam and Islamic extremism in Europe. They viewed his defiance as a rallying cry for their own causes, further polarizing the political landscape. The incident became a flashpoint in the larger culture war that was unfolding across Europe, where issues of immigration, religious identity, and national sovereignty were increasingly being debated. Momika's supporters hailed him as a hero, a champion of free speech who had the courage to take a stand against what they saw as an existential threat to European values. They argued that his actions were necessary to defend the principles of secularism and freedom of expression, even if they were offensive to some. On the other hand, his critics accused him of deliberately stoking hatred and division, arguing that his actions were not a legitimate form of protest but a deliberate attempt to incite violence and intolerance. In the wake of the burning of the Quran, a broader conversation emerged about the limits of free speech and the responsibility that comes with expressing controversial ideas. Could freedom of expression justify actions that deeply offended the beliefs of others? Was it acceptable to provoke religious groups by desecrating their sacred texts, even in the name of free speech? These were the questions that dominated public discourse in Sweden and beyond. In the Muslim world, the burning of the Quran was seen as an affront to the very foundation of the faith. Many Muslim leaders called for diplomatic action against Sweden, urging the government to hold Momika accountable for his actions. They argued that such acts of disrespect towards religious symbols could not be tolerated, as they only served to inflame tensions between different religious and cultural groups. In some countries, the incident led to violent protests, with people expressing their anger and frustration at what they saw as a deliberate provocation. As the weeks and months passed, the controversy surrounding Salwan Momika's actions continued to escalate. In Sweden, protests against his act led to increased security measures, both in public spaces and in government institutions. The country became a focal point for debates about freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and the limits of protest. The situation was further complicated by the rise of anti-Muslim rhetoric in some parts of Europe, which many believed was fueled in part by Momika's actions. Despite the international backlash, Salwan Momika remained resolute in his beliefs. He continued to defend his act of burning the Quran, insisting that he had not intended to provoke violence but had merely sought to make a statement about the dangers of religious extremism. His defiance only served to heighten tensions, as both his supporters and his detractors became increasingly entrenched in their respective positions. In 2025, 2 years after the controversial event, Salwan Momika's life was tragically cut short. His death, which was the result of a targeted attack, sent shockwaves through the world. While the exact details of his death remained unclear, it was widely believed to be a direct consequence of the animosity generated by his act of burning the Quran. For many, his death symbolized the dangerous consequences of religious and cultural polarization, and the escalating violence that often accompanies such acts of provocation. Momika's death sparked a new wave of debate about the implications of his actions and the broader issue of freedom of speech in an increasingly divided world. Was he a martyr for free speech, or had he brought about his own demise through his reckless defiance? The answer, of course, is not simple, and the legacy of Salwan Momika continues to provoke strong opinions on both sides of the debate. As we reflect on the life and death of Salwan Momika, we are reminded of the fragile nature of peace in our interconnected world. His story highlights the dangers of divisive rhetoric, the complexity of balancing freedom of expression with respect for religious beliefs, and the profound impact that one person's actions can have on a global scale.